2-minute warning. All right, let's go ahead and we'll start finding our seats and somewhat come into order. We'll let you start, okay? All right, so we're Daniel chapter 9, and a couple of announcements just before we begin. Just coming up in a couple of weeks, February 22nd is Ash Wednesday, and we'll have an Ash Wednesday service that evening. February 26th, which is a Sunday, the last Sunday this month, John Few and Gil McBride they're going to do, during the Sunday school hour, go over or thematically through C.S. Lewis's work, Screw Tape Letters. So I think some Sunday school classes have already, they're going to be there, but just want to give you some, just kind of an FYI. And then, hard to imagine, but Holy Week's around the corner. So, yeah, that's also spring break. So we won't meet that particular week. We'll have Holy Week lunches. And those will be Monday through Thursday, but just it's right around the corner. It's kind of crazy. Any other announcements we need to hit or mention before we begin that y'all know of that I don't? I'm normally the last one to figure it out here at the church, so Kathy and Teresa are the ones that are probably more up to date on all the announcements more than I am. But I do know those. Going around is the prayer pad. Also, if you're at home and you're watching, Betty Hips sends out an email. I think she sent it out yesterday. And you can put a prayer request on the email or write it down on the pad, and Betty will compile them and then send them out on Wednesday for us. And then also going around is the refreshment list. I think we might be all squared up through the spring, but if not, you want to provide refreshments one day, feel free to do so. All right, all good? Anything else? We ready? All right, well, let's pray and we'll begin. Lord, today we're grateful for this chance to come and share together. What we're always after is not just the fellowship of being together, but the act of study and not just wanting to know what the book of Daniel says, but we want it to be applied to our life in such a way that with the addition of your Spirit, it leads to growth inside of us. The end goal is the same. We want our nature to reflect the nature of Christ in both word and deed. So guide us and direct us, O Lord. We're mindful of the things that are going on in our community, the things around the world, particularly those that are in the wake of the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and just the aftermath of all that. And then all the unrest that exists in the world, in the Middle East, in the Ukraine, all of this, oh God, we ask for your guidance and your hand, and we pray for peace, and we ask this in your name. Amen. All right, so Daniel chapter 9, just a little recap, because it's been a couple of weeks. It seems like I can't get on the right schedule, right? So about the time, when I don't have to travel, I get sick. So Dan, uh, um, that's right. So, well, January the 7th, that's close enough, right? Yeah, we're it's February 7th, so we're only off by a month. You're close enough, you know. That's exactly right. Yeah. So, yeah, put February 7th on top. How about that? So, yeah. So, you know, that's normally what I do. There are so many Post-it notes around this church where I've set something down and can't remember, and I've got probably 10 pair of glasses all over the place. So, who knows? And if y'all leave yours, we recycle them. So, I mean, if they fit my eyes, let me tell you, I've got a nice set of ladies' cheaters in my office that works well. So, all right, so Daniel chapter 9, just a little recap about Daniel. Daniel, the book itself, is divided into two main halves. The first half is the historical information that's tied to Daniel. That's chapters 1 through 6. That's all the VBS stories, the Sunday school stories of Daniel and the dietary laws, Daniel and the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. All that is in those first 6 chapters. Chapters 7 through 12 is where we move in away from the historical information, more into what we would call apocalyptic writing. And that's the visions, that's the dreams, that's where each chapter is filled with all types of imagery, symbolism, and parsing that is harder than, say, the first half of the book. The first half of the book is fairly easy. The second half of the book is fairly difficult when it comes to its interpretation, and you're going to see that again in chapter 9 today, because apocalyptic writing, by nature, that genre, stresses a couple of things. One, it stresses the sovereignty of God. At the same time, it has something to do with either the issue of time, and it could be the time is at the day of Daniel. It could be just a hair in the future with Daniel, or it could be talking about first Advent Gospels, or it could be talking about second Advent return of Christ. And what biblical scholars don't like is just not as clear as what we want it to be. And so what we can do is by looking at the context and then also looking back in history, maybe, you know, doing the best we can as to maybe what this is actually dealing with. And just fair warning, Daniel 9 is the hardest chapter in the book of Daniel. Yeah, so, you know, I'm glad y'all buckled up and had a good breakfast. So the first part of Daniel chapter 9 is fairly easy. It's just a prayer. The second half, where you get where Gabriel weighs in and gives insight into the prayer, that's when it could be, frankly, one of about 3 or 4 different possibilities. And so what I normally do is lay out the cases for each one, and then I'll just kind of weigh in on where I think it is. So, but whether or not somebody agrees or disagrees with me, that is totally fine, because it's just not as clear as what we would want it to be. So, all right. So let's look at Daniel chapter 9. So what we'll do is, if somebody's interested, if they could read for us just verses 1 and 2. And this is the circumstances or the introduction, some introductory comments that set the stage for this prayer that Daniel's going to pray. This is going to be the least amount of verses. If you plan to be a reader, this is the one you want to sign up for. All right, so yeah, so yeah, in the first year of Darius, yeah. The son of Xerxes or Ahasuerus, whichever, depending on what your Bible is. All right, so I'll read. In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, some of your versions actually says the Greek name or title, Xerxes, of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is another word for the Babylonians. In the first year of his reign, I, Darius, perceived in the books the numbers of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. All right, so just a little bit of background information. This is about 12 years after chapter 8. And in these vision chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8, both of those take place either in between the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the Persians, King Darius. So 7 and 8 fall in that time period. 9 happens right after the Persians take over the Babylonians. So when Daniel was about 12, 13 years old, he's deported under the Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar. You might remember that name. Nebuchadnezzar comes in from the north, down through Syria and what we know as Syria, what we know as Lebanon today, and they conquer all of Israel. And for about 7 or 8 years, Nebuchadnezzar set up a puppet sort of king of Jerusalem and Judah. And then after those 7 or 8 years, eventually he just annihilates the place, makes it into a pancake, and then deports all of the best and brightest back to Babylon so that they would be indoctrinated into the Babylonian system. That's chapter 1 of the book of Daniel. And so Daniel was one of those. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were some of the ones that were deported. And Nebuchadnezzar ruled for, I think, 47 years or so. And then you've got about 10 or 15 different kings who ruled in a 12-year period of time. And then the last king of Babylon, that's the writing on the wall chapter, where the Persians are really at the city gates, and the night of this big banquet, the Persians overtake and ransack the city of Babylon, and of course the Babylonians are wiped out. And then the next big ruler of the day are the Persians. And Persian, it started out as the Medes, and then it became the Medes and the Persians, and eventually it became the Persians. They're like sisters more than anything else. And so in history, we either refer to them as the Persians or we refer to them as the Medes and the Persians. But eventually the Medes are sort of die out, and it's just what we would know as the Persians. Their first king was Darius. Some versions sometimes say Cyrus. Darius is a Mede name. Cyrus is a Persian name. So it would be, synonyms more than anything else. In that day, it's not uncommon for, if you conquered an empire, you would, list all the goodness of that empire as if they were part of your empire, as just part of your descendants. But you're the last one that's listed, which would show that you're sort of the ruler of them all. And so that's what you have in the book of Daniel. And so this is 12 years, about 12 years after chapter 8. And the reason why we know that is because what is different between 7 and 8, chapter 7 and 8, is that he's talking about it from a new king. And we knew that the new king, after he conquered the Babylonians, he sets up his reign, and this is roughly about the time when his reign is established and we're all good. So that's the context, at least time-wise, of when we find chapter 9 in the life of Daniel. Now, Daniel, age-wise, is probably, he's well into the back nine. So he's probably, in that day, he's probably 80 years old, roughly. And so he's just a handful of years before it's his death. So are y'all cold? Okay, all right. So, because it was warm in here, so I turned the air on. So if you get cold, let me know. I was hot when I first walked in here. So, but it's about 8 years after chapter 8. This is, Daniel has this dream, or has this, chapter 9 takes place in the latter parts of Daniel's life, because Daniel only lived a little bit into the Persian Empire. and then eventually he dies. But he mentions something, and this is really important. In in verse 2, he actually mentions another prophet. Who? Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, man, this guy would never die. And I mean, he lived through about 5 or 10 different kingdoms. And talking about someone who's just in a continual state of melancholy, that was Jeremiah. So, I mean, he's called the weeping prophet because every last one of his visions and his prophecies are all about the downfall of Israel, and particularly the tribe of Judah, the kingdom of the southern kingdom. But Daniel, so this is what we know, is that Daniel had access to his writings. Does your Bible say does any of your Bibles say like the scriptures, or does it mention Holy Word or something like that? Yeah, scriptures. Yeah, so scriptures for Daniel would have been the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and that's the law, and it would have been some of the prophets. Maybe some of Isaiah, maybe some of Jeremiah. There are some books mentioned in the Old Testament that are tied, like when you read the Kings, what we call the historicals, it'll say, King Shane, blah, 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 and then it'll say his accounts are also recorded in the annals of King whatever of Israel. Those have been lost to history. So we do know that there was a record that maybe Daniel or somebody else might have had access to that's just not part of what we would call Kings or Chronicles or the Samuels and things like that. But those books, the historicals, are later than some of the prophets. So Daniel would have had access to the Torah. Obviously, he has access to some part of Jeremiah. So if you would, turn back about a book or two, and I want you to look at Jeremiah chapter 25, and we're going to look at verses 7 through 14. Because what Daniel is referencing in this prayer, chapter 25, verses 7 through 14, is this period of time of 70 years. And Daniel is probably 83, 85, so he's been in Babylon about 70 years. And what Jeremiah prophesied about in chapter 25 was the Babylonian captivity. And so in Daniel's mind, and this is his interpretation of Jeremiah, the time of captivity is coming to an end. All right? So we'll just look at Jeremiah 25 7 through 14. Actually, verse 8 is really all we need. Verse 8 through 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words. Now, this is Jeremiah prophesying about the southern kingdom. Behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about that. And then skip down to verse 12. Then, after what? 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and the nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste, which happened under Cyrus or Darius and the Persians. So Daniel had access to Jeremiah, and for lack of better words, he's been counting the days, waiting for these 70 years to be over. Because in Daniel's mind and his contemporaries, this time of captivity should be coming to an end. Now, what's interesting, and this is just really just, you got to scratch your head, Darius or Cyrus, either one, they signed a decree to allow the Israelites to go home about 70 years of captivity. So this is at that time, which is why we have a pretty good date of when it took place. Daniel is taken into captivity around 12, 13 years old. This is about 70 years later is when Darius gives the decree to allow them to return. And so to put this in a larger context of the Old Testament, you think of the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is part of the royal court, cupbearer for the king. You can read the book of Nehemiah. He's upset one day. The king asks him, "Why are you upset?" And says, "Well, my home doesn't have we don't have a gate. We don't have a wall." And so Nehemiah sent back as part of that wave of people who can finally return home. And he, under his care and some other people, they rebuild the wall. And then you've got Ezra when it comes to rebuilding the temple. And so this is the beginning of all of that. And it's 70 years, roughly, it's actually 68 and some change, after the time that Daniel was taken into captivity. So Daniel, as well as all the other Jews, all the other Israelites that are in captivity, according to the book of Jeremiah, they are counting the days, waiting for the time to come to an end. That is going to be all about his prayer. So the initial context, or at least the introduction to his prayer is, if you can imagine, Daniel's got his captivity calendar up, and he's just turning the days until finally it gets about 70 years, and he says, "Okay, God, now it should be at the end." And that's going to be his prayer. So this is the context. 605, Daniel's taken captive. About 70 years later, Cyrus issues the decree for them to go home, if they want to. Now, Daniel never does. He doesn't make the trip, but a number of them returned. All right? Good? All clear? So now let's look at the prayer. And this is an interesting prayer, to say the least. And anyway, I'll let you just read it, and we can kind of just decide for ourselves. So, anybody want to take a gander? Give it a run. Nope. And if it has hard words, just make them up as you go. Nobody knows them anywhere. All right. So, So start with verse 3, and then we'll run to verse 14. Well, if you want to break it up, let's go 3 to 8, and then if somebody will just pick it up and go from 8 to 14. All right, so if somebody would pick it up there, verse 8. All right.
O Lord, we and our kings, our princes, and our fathers are covered with shame, because we have sinned against you. The Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the Lord our God, or kept the laws he gave us through his servants, the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned away. Therefore the curses and sworn judgments written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out on us because we have sinned against you. words spoken against us and against our rulers by bringing upon us great disaster. Under the whole heaven, nothing has ever been done like what has been done to Jerusalem. Just as it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come upon us, yet we have not sought the favor of our Lord by turning from our sins and giving attention to your truth. The Lord did not hesitate to bring this disaster upon us, for the Lord our God is righteous in everything he does, yet we have not obeyed him. Now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and who made for yourself a name that endures to this day, we have sinned, we have done wrong. O Lord, in keeping with all your righteous acts, turn away your anger and your wrath from Jerusalem, your city, your holy hill. Our sins and the iniquities of our fathers have made Jerusalem and your people an object of scorn to all those around us. Now, O God, hear the prayers and petitions of your servant, and for your sake, O Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, O God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, listen. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hear and act. For your sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name.
So, what do you think of his prayer? It's kind of, so it's an interesting prayer, and it's divided into three sections. In the first part, just one verse or so, you have this adoration. So if you're looking for a prayer, like a way to pray or a format of prayer, let's just look at it as a possible model for us. You have the beginning of this idea of, in verse 4, of adoration. And what Daniel does, again, so he's counting the days, for these 70 years to be up. And what we know from Jeremiah is that the reason that they're in the place that they're in is because Judah did not keep the covenant. God kept the covenant. And so since Judah sinned and did not keep the covenant, they're in the spot that they're in today. And so Daniel begins his prayer by reminding God of his covenant love. And the whole prayer really is about this right here. It's actually two words in the Greek. So this goes back to all the different major covenants in the Old Testament. It starts with Abraham, the idea that I'm going to make you a great nation. It moves then over into Moses and the covenant he gave with Moses. So you see the two major covenants that are, Daniel summarizes both of those here. And he reminds God of that God is a covenant God who keeps his side of the bargain, even when people do not. And this word for love is actually the word hesed, which is a great Hebrew word. It actually means more than love. It means like an abounding love, a love that's full, and so it's describing God, that God is one who always keeps his covenant. Hessed. Hesed. And so that psalm that says the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever, something, the steadfast love of the Lord, it's just that one word, hesed. Your hesed endures forever. So Hessed. Sometimes it doesn't have the H, but Hebrew, you got you have to get some, you have to go like you got a cold or something. But yeah, you're hesed, so, but anyway, so he begins the prayer by reminding God of who God is and what God does. Not that God needs to be reminded, but that's how he frames the beginning of his prayer. And then he goes through this long confession from verse 5 to verse 14, And there are 6 different ways that he describes how God has been faithful, and yet the children of Israel or Judah was not faithful. He says that at first he says they sinned, and he says we. It's actually he puts himself in there. We've sinned, we've done wrong, we've been wicked, we've rebelled, we've turned away, we have not listened. Now your versions might have maybe a couple of different words, but it's the similar concept. All in light of this compare and contrast, how God has been faithful even when the people have not been faithful. Obviously that word sin, it's amartia. That's in the Greek word. So and it means to fall short, to miss the mark. The idea of shooting at a target and you miss the target. That's the word. The Hebrew word is hata, H-A-T-A, but the Greek equivalent is amartia. You might have heard of that. This idea of done wrong is, if you can imagine a road that is straight and you bend it all up and mess it all up, that's what it means by done wrong. And so think back to some of the Messiah pieces like that we sing sometimes at Christmas, where they quote from Isaiah, "Make straight a highway, make straight the paths." That in the Old Testament, righteousness is normally described as a straight path. And so to make it where it's not straight, to bend it all up, it's the opposite of being righteous. Well, that's what this word picture is for done wrong. We have either perverted, we have twisted, we have bent up what you've designed to be straight. We've been wicked. The idea is that there is a full understanding and ownership of the guilt of crimes that have been committed. That's that word picture. Turned away. The idea is that literally turned away from God, moving in a different direction. And then, of course, the last one, just not listen or rebelled. That's another one. I didn't talk about that. That's straightforward. Doesn't really need much to it. But the idea of not listen, the ear is the organ that is always used to describe obedience. So to not listen means that you are not obeying. So again, 6 different ways that Daniel does a compare-contrast, because he talks about all the ways that Israel has not kept the covenant or didn't keep the covenant, seen in the light that God keeps the covenant. And so, it's just over and over and over again. And it's a confession. Now, here's something. Is he confessing his own stuff? He wasn't alive. Which is interesting here. So he is, it's one thing to confess and say, well, you know what, I personally have done these things. He is standing in the gap and interceding corporately for the people. Now, contrast that to how people act today. Yeah, so the prayer of confession, same thing. It's plural, we, and not me or you. In our society, we've to some degree, there's not a high level or a palate for wanting to own something that might not be yours, but because you're part of the group, you'll take it on as yours. Daniel wasn't even alive when some of this stuff happened. But he sees himself as part of this corporate body. And so even though it's not his individual, he puts himself in the gap for others. And I think there's some value to that, and there's a premium. I mean, it's very Christ-like if we were to fast forward into the New Testament. He who knew no sin became sin, right? You know, or, so I mean, you think about the 7 last words of Jesus when he's on a cross. I mean, there's so many ways that we can go with this. But what's, I think, great about this confession is Daniel's not worried about whether or not it's his tick marks or whether or not it's somebody else's tick marks. He just wants the 70 years to come to an end. And he's reminding God. How's he started? Lord, you're a covenant God. And your hesed endures forever. And you have been faithful to this covenant that dates back into Genesis. And we see it all through, from Abraham's life. We see it in Moses' life. You have always been faithful, even when we have not, historically, as a people. But he's not trying to he's not dividing the house. Well, it's really not mine, it's theirs. I'm a part of them, but it's really their fault, God. I mean, no, he just fully sets into, we've done this as a people.
Do you think this is what happened to the Jews during Hitler?
As in confessing or as in causation? Yeah, so so the question is, in times of history where there are atrocities against either Jews or the children of Israel, it is, what do we make of that? Is that fair? Because I want to hold that because we're going to get into causation in just a second. And so I think that's where your question is there, what level, obviously Daniel says we've sinned, we've done all these things, and because of that, we're in captivity. So does that mean, what's the causation between sin and, maybe punishment or judgment or whatever it may be? And if it is, whose hand is it? What's the correlation between that? And which is a fair question to ask. And we'll just go ahead and jump in. So, hang on, let me finish the prayer and then we'll come back to that. Let's do that. So, but before we leave the confession part, one of the things that, people will do with chapter 9 that I think we need to be a little bit careful, all right? So, Daniel's style of government and society for them was a theocracy, which means God is at the top, and you had a spokesperson for God, either a king or a priest or a prophet, and they were the voice of God and the ruling person in the government. All right? We live in a democracy, which is where we elect representatives to act and to govern on behalf of us. So often what people will do is they'll say, well, we need to pray this for our nation or our people because we're going to be in the same boat or are in the same boat as Daniel. That might be true, but you also need to acknowledge that it's 2 different ways of government or even responsibility. Old Testament is completely different than, as in how they operated when it comes to government and responsibility and things like that than it is in our day and time. Now, there might be some similarities, but whenever we take stuff from the Old Testament and we want to apply it as if it's the same in all of its structure to our day and time, just make sure you're parsing it correctly. You with me? I see some puzzled looks. Maybe, maybe not. So let me ask it this way. Is it fair for us to pray this same thing for the United States? Should we? We should do something? Yeah. Yeah, so one of the questions, or one of the answers is why not? Yeah, it's fine. I think it's a great prayer, but I would say it's a good prayer to pray and not limit it to just one particular government, but to see it larger than, see it, say this has to deal with humanity, not tied to just a specific government. Now, if we lived in the same type of government or the same type of society as the Old Testament, then I think it's very fair to do it. But we don't live in a theocracy. And the idea that the United States is like the new Israel, you cannot hold water with that when it comes to the Bible. But that is inside of Christian thought. The reason I'm saying that is because inside of Christian thought, that's where some people live. And just that's fine, but it's you're almost taking like a square, a square peg and you're trying to force it into a round hole. That's all I'm saying. I think it's great to pray, and I think it's incredibly Christ-like to put yourself in a place of intercession where you see where there are things that are not representative of God and you want that to change. Just be careful when it comes to how you ascribe that to government leaders. That's all I'm saying. All right? Because in our society, we have a tendency to do that. Right? They just go back and think about the last election, all right? You know what I mean? So, and then the next election that comes, you'll do the same. I mean, not you, but it'll happen again. You just want to be careful there. Because that's where, you're talking about two different styles of structure. And, so you have to take, okay, what of this structure and things of that nature fits perfectly into this today and what doesn't? All right? So that might not be an issue, and you might not, this might be like, well, Shane, don't even waste any time on that, which is fine. Good on you. Yeah, so it to some degree it is, but for in the Old Testament, the king, or at least so you come out. So first it was Moses, all right, and after Moses you have Joshua, and then you have the judges, and the judges were these area rulers who were the spokesperson for God. And they were deemed or elected or appointed. And then you get into, you have prophets like Samuel and priests. And Samuel's sort of a mixture of the two, and he's the last one. And then after Samuel, get into kings. And the kings I want to be careful on how I describe this. They were the people that represented the spirituality of the nation. And so when the kings were good, the people prospered. When the kings were not, so did the people. They made rules or they made laws as if they're representing God to the people. That's the style of government. We just don't live in that style of government, right? So to then say, okay, the reason we've gotten this place is because we've sinned, and the chief center of that were the leaders, the kings. That's where we can get kind of trouble, because then we could say, okay, in our day and time, the leaders are the spiritual, like the governmental leaders are the spiritual thermometers of the people. A little bit, yeah. So, because we, in a democracy, you don't elect spiritual leaders. In a theocracy, it is. Because you blur spirituality, faith, and leadership. Our country is not founded that way. There's a separation of the two. Now, they might influence each other, right? But that's what I mean by there's a difference. And so to see this as a prayer for all people, or to see this as a prayer for any nation, fantastic. But to assume that this prayer that Daniel prayed is specifically for one nation or one people, then that's where we can get kind of, maybe not, if that makes sense. So Yeah, so you could do that as well. Yeah, I think that would probably be a very good analogy. So the statement was, can you make a comparison to the church? Absolutely. And so I think this is a great prayer to pray. And even if it's not the same words that you pray, I think the concepts or the aspects of the prayer are really important to own, because for a couple of reasons. You see, I mean, there's one, it's not, you're willing to vicariously take ownership for just the state of reality or humanity or whatever it may be. And there's a desire that you want God to bring healing and to bring peace and to bring, justice and wholeness. Right? So on that level, that's what Daniel's doing. I'm just trying to caution us that because and it might not be here. Listen, and I'm not trying to beat this horse to death, but in some Christian circles, this becomes the what the Old Testament and today's government. I mean, it's like, oh, we got to make sure they're like this, and that's never going to happen because you're talking about two different things. So just on something like that, I want to be careful. Right? It doesn't mean you can have the same. I mean, you can have the same desire and hope and things like that, but it doesn't. You're talking about two different styles of government, two different ways that people acted, and on that level, it's not always it doesn't always fit well. That's all I'm saying. But you have this level of ownership, of intercession on behalf of Daniel, and to some degree, corporate confession. All seen in light of, Lord, you're the covenant one. We've broken it. And now, when we move into verse 15 through 19, that's really the high mark or the crux of the prayer, because what Daniel is desiring is for that this would come to an end. That, verse 17, listen to your servant who's praying. Bend your ear towards us, incline your ear, open your eyes, see that the level of desolation and the level of destruction, that has been full. And so there's nothing else that's needed. And so Daniel is, Daniel's, asking God, in beautiful language, hasn't the 70 years been fulfilled? Isn't it now time for an end? We've suffered enough. So that gets to Kay's point. How do we justify, what's the relationship between sin and consequences? And in the Old Testament, the major theme of God in the Old Testament is the sovereignty of God. So nothing happens without God's knowledge. Nothing happens without God's hand. One of the conclusions that's drawn is that if that is the case, then anything that happens, even if it is destruction or punishment or tragedy or whatever it may be, is also under God's umbrella and not without His hand or not without His knowledge. Now, in the Old Testament, they're comfortable with 1-to-1. You sinned, you're in trouble. In the New Testament, not so much. All right, so turn to John 9. New Testament, Gospel of John. So in John chapter 9, so this is how the chapter begins. Jesus is walking into a city. And as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And how does Jesus respond? Exactly right. So there's a little bit of transition between Old Testament and New Testament about the relationship of being, is it 1-to-1? Or is there just some level of ambiguity? In the Old Testament, it does try to balance the one-to-one correlation and the fact that God still is gracious because God leaves a remnant, or God remembers the covenant and he doesn't forsake. In the New Testament, that latter part is just clearer. So to answer your question, Kay, is don't know.
I know, but see, the Jews don't believe in Jesus, so they still going under that old covenant.
Yeah, so, but the question you asked dealt with are tragedies that happen to them. Is that, I'm assuming you were asking, is that somehow related to sin? Is that fair?
I guess. But righteous, somebody did something evil.
Sure. Yeah, so to answer your question, I would say no. I don't think that's a one-to-one. I think there are tragedies that happen to people, and there were the tragedies of World War II are well documented. But and I'm not trying to make light of that. That fits within a larger view of all types of tragedies from World War II. It's hard to sort of get a single answer when it involves a ton of things. If you're Japanese, what do you think about it? Particularly if you lived in Nagasaki. Is that a tragedy? So, I'm not trying to blame. We're not assigning blame. In the depravity of humanity and the level of what the destruction of what sin does in just general, capital S, we are way out of, we're not in Kansas anymore. And the best analogy, if you pull up, I think it's on YouTube, if we put a bunch of mouse traps in this room and you put a ping pong ball, and it's just one mouse trap right there, say 1,000 mouse traps, and you stand outside of here and you chunk just one ping pong ball in this room, what happens in about 3 minutes? All of them go. And so to some degree, that's the world that we live in. And this is where I think we have, personally, this is all Shane's opinion here, we have no clue the destruction of our choices and how that affects an individual, and then how that affects just the world on a cosmic level over time. And so Daniel's prayer to me is fantastic. Lord, we're constantly messing it up. And we want to remind you that you're a covenant God, not just here, but you're a covenant God for all. And so don't forget your covenant. As jacked up as we can be. That's a nice Greek word, isn't it? So the way I think God, sovereignty, grace, and judgment all sit together. If you believe in justice, there's got to be judgment. You cannot get one without the other, right? So, in the desire to stress God's sovereignty, you do get an uncomfortable causation that sometimes it is at the hand of God. The way I would interpret that is that God does not necessarily relieve people of the consequences of their choices. And that can be seen as punishment, obviously, if you're the one that's living into the consequences. Or, maybe it could just be from a different angle. It could just be it's you can't stop certain things from happening if you make certain levels of choices. And, that's the problem for us, I would argue, is that it's not as clean as what we want it. Because we have to live with a little bit of ambiguity when you look at how does God interact with a world where it's not equal. I mean, the ledger from God's side is never going to be equal to the ledger of humanity's side. And so you can be a little bit like Job, or Job's family, or Job's wife, or the three, Larry, Curly, and Moe, his friends, right? And, finally, the way the book of Job ends is almost where Job just scratches his head and says, you know what? The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the Lord. Or like the writer of Ecclesiastes, I've looked and observed, and there's not a one-to-one correlation. But I've also looked, in spite of that, there is one who still remembers the covenant. And for that, I'll follow. I mean, that's the Ecclesiastes. So, but that I would want to caution all of us to look for really easy answers to very complex questions. And the Bible can help form us, but it's, even holding the righteousness of God, which is relational justice, and the love of God together, you can't hold them like this. You have to hold them like this. And trust that in the end, God's wisdom and goodness and grace sees people through to wholeness. However that looks for people. And for some, it's going to be very painful, and for others, maybe not so much. But the end goal is where God wants to get everybody. All right? So that's probably a good time to take a break, process a little bit of this. We'll come back in about 10 minutes. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. Who is?
Miriam Graham,
Okay.
Mimi's daughter. Mm-hmm. She's there. She has breast cancer.
Yeah, she does.
And she said, I'm so worried about my mama. And I said, and she said she's just worried about me.
Oh yeah,
So
she
she's
yeah
worried about her. She's worried about me.
yeah.
But I said, you're in a place now where fall back on your faith.
Right.
And she said, I just wish I could.
Yeah. I will. I mean, she. We've reached. What happens? And mixed sort of receptivity, and so hopefully she'll come back. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so just yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm gonna give it. What I tell folks is give it a year. Actually, act like you do for a year, and let's just see what happens. That's right. That's right. Well, the best growth always takes place in times of crisis. Nobody grows when it's easy. So, all right, let's go ahead and come together because we have 20 minutes. we have 20 minutes to deal with 4 verses that are the hardest 4 verses in the Bible to interpret. So that's the good news. And then we'll be finished with chapter 9, and you can go to lunch, and then we'll move on to something that's easier, right? So the way we left it, Daniel has this long, wonderful prayer, has adoration, has confession, has a petition. Daniel's counting the days of the 70 years to be over with the expectation that everything that was required, if needed, that has been accomplished. And it's time now for something new. No more, if you want to use the word punishment, no more judgment, no more tragedy. People need to be reestablished. And for Daniel, what that looked like was the reestablishment of his home, Judah, Israel. So what we have in verse 20, and I'm going to read verses 20 just for the sake of time, or a little bit, is as soon as Daniel is praying, God gives an answer in the form of Gabriel. So let's pick it up and look. Verse 20, we're going to go from verse 20 to 23. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I have seen in the vision at the first, remember this is not the first time Daniel has seen Gabriel, showed up in other, in 7, I think in either 7 or 8, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. This would have been maybe 3 or 4 in the afternoon for Daniel. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. That part is easy. Gabriel showed up between the 3rd and 4th hour at the time of sacrifice, says, don't worry, Daniel, God's got you. Let me tell you what he says. This is when it gets really, really confusing. So this is the answer. And then after I read it, somebody can interpret it for us. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put to an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. That's important. So you got 70 weeks, then you got 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks, another time period, it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Think back to chapter 8 when we have an introduction to a prince. Now, this is not the Prince of Peace, opposite. Its end shall come with a flood, and at the end there shall be war, desolation are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, another time period, and for half of a week, another time period. He shall put to an end sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decree end is poured out on the desolator. All right, what does that mean? That's exactly, the answer was we don't know. You are correct. All right, so I mean, this is where, again, so anytime we talk about this type of writing, apocalyptic writing, it could be, there's a time frame which is unknown. And then there are all these symbols, and the struggle is we don't know if they're literal or symbolic. And because there are times where 7 means 7. And there are times when 70 actually means 70. But there are also times where 7 doesn't mean 7, it means completeness. And 70 doesn't mean 70, it's not a euphemism, but close to it, that is symbolic where it stands for maybe a long completed time. Same with 40, things like that. So numbers in the Old Testament and in Jewish thought could be either one. And so that's the struggle with this interpreting this particular passage, because we don't have a frame of reference like we did in chapter 7 or like we did in chapter 8, which leads us to 3 possible views. All right? So one is more literal. So from the time of 605 BC or the time of 605 BC is when Daniel's deported. From that time until the guy from chapter 8, Antiochus, who was a leader in Syria, I think like 155 BC, who was just a bad person. He's the guy that killed all types of Jews, all types of Israelites. He set up the statue of Zeus inside the temple. He stopped all the dietary laws. He stopped all the sacrifices, and he ruled for just a small period of time, just a short period of time. So if you take these concepts of you've got 70 years of captivity, then you've got a 7-week period of time, and then you've got 62 weeks period of time, and then you've got another week period of time, you can get pretty close to this guy here in historical time. So there is what some biblical writers and scholars interpret this literally when it comes to the numbers. And this would make sense because it fits the bill. This guy right here, when we looked at chapter 8, remember that's the one where you have the ram, and then you have the little goat, and then the goat destroys the ram. The ram's Persia. The goat is Alexander the Great. and the goat has these horns, and some of the horns fall off. Alexander the Great dies, and then the 4 horns come up. There's 4 generals, but then there's one that comes out of that one horn, and he's kind of a small horn in the beginning, but then he grows to be great, powerful. That's this guy here. And it fits that because when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, he only lived for a little bit. Right after, so he died, then his 4 generals divided up his empire. One of the generals that had access over Syria and what we know as Israel in that area, if you follow him or follow his descendants down for about 3 or 4, eventually you get to him. And he's just a horrible dude. And he's terrible to Jews. And so from Daniel's perspective, in that vision, he fits the bill of this prince. And historically, we have enough historical evidence to show that, yeah, that kind of makes sense here. He fits some of the bill for some of this. The fact that time-wise, it also fits with the numbers, some people say this is how to interpret those 4 verses. Some say it has nothing to do with literal translation of the numbers. It's more symbolic, and the time issue is from the decree of Cyrus. So you have the 70 years of captivity. After the 70 years, Cyrus takes over, destroys the Babylons, and issues a decree for those that want. Those Jews can return to their homeland and rebuild. And so for these biblical folks, they start the clock here. And so they run it to a time, and again, the numbers aren't literal, they're symbolic. So when you read that, you've got where, look at verse 24, where it talks about the finish of transgressions, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity. Those biblical scholars see this larger than just what Daniel's talking about in his prayer. They see that as capital S sin or capital I iniquity. Well, who is the atonement for sin? So you go from Darius all the way up to Jesus, 7 weeks, 62 weeks. This is where they get in trouble. And then they say there's an unknown time, for how many years, we don't know, until the Antichrist, not an Antichrist, comes up, and you get this whole tribulation 7 years. Remember that last year, 7 years? 3.5 one way, 3.5 the other way. 7 years of tribulation, 3.5 where the Antichrist rules, and then 3.5 where that unruling gets unwound. All right, now I tell you, I don't buy this one. So I'm just going to tell you up front. I buy this. I don't buy all that. I think they're trying to push that in.
Do you buy verse 24 as being like prophecy of Jesus?
70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put to an end sin, and to atonement of iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most high place. I don't know. I kind of go back and forth. I'm more in the literal camp than anything else. But it does fit if you want to look at it symbolically. Here's my struggle with that. I can live with it to some degree. My struggle with that is Daniel sees all of this through a Jewish mind. And the idea that the Messiah is going to be the atonement for sin is not a Jewish concept. That's a New Testament concept, book of Hebrews. Well, the atonement was sacrifice. You go slaughter a bull at the appropriate time, the priest. And so the reason why this guy was hated is because he outlawed all sacrifices, personal or corporate. I mean, he cut it off for like 12 years. And so when this decree is given, that begins the process of Jews returning to Jerusalem to build the wall, to reestablish the temple, and to reestablish the worship. And the worship was not the way we do every week. The worship was you traveled to Jerusalem 7 times a year, and you participated in the feasts, and as part of those feasts, there were corporate sacrifices for the people. And then for your individual sins, you would either go down to the local priest, synagogue, or to the temple, and you would kind of do that as needed. But the daily issue of your spirituality was in daily prayers. You prayed at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, noon, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and then before you went to bed. So, this is what I don't like about this. All right? So I think what this does is it takes this idea of a 7-year tribulation, which I think that's got problems in and of itself, and you try to force it into the book of Daniel. All with symbolic thought. This is taking those 4 verses and seeing them symbolically and just letting it sit with ending with Messiah. And I think that can hold weight if it is a symbolic interpretation, or I think it's this, if it is a literal. I think because it's not clear in the book of Daniel if Daniel is talking about the Antichrist or an Antichrist. Like at any time period, there could be someone who's opposite of God, and if that's the case, then they fit the bill for being an Antichrist because they're opposite of, or opposite of Messiah. And the Messiah is to establish the rule of the kingdom of God in a Jewish mindset and in a Christian mindset. So that's what we have in similar. We're similar there. So anything that is opposite of establishing that rule could be interpreted as Antichrist. But we don't know if that's lowercase a or uppercase a. We don't know. I think those who want to see this as uppercase A, I think they force it into the text. And, but I'm not, if someone came up to me and said, Shane, this is it, 100%, okay, if it's literal, if you interpret the time frame as literal, you get to this guy here. Same thing we looked at in chapter 8. And he's a brutal, terrible person. So he checks all the box, right? But if you interpret this as just straight symbolism of time, then I think you can get to Messiah being the end. I don't know if you were, what Harriet mentioned, she's not trying to say this is, but she says it fits the bill to an end of all sin, an end to all iniquity, an end to all that. Well, from the Christian perspective, who is that? Well, that's the Messiah. It does. So both of them checks the box. Both of them will check the box, but it really sits on this. This is the crux of the issue. Is it a literal interpretation of the time frame, or is it a symbolic or a theological interpretation of the time frame? And if you sort of lean in to the numbers aren't literal, they're symbolic, they're theological, well, yeah, you can get here. I'm like 51-49, all right? So, I'm not, and some of that stems from I can live with this, to be honest with you. But I interpret the book of Revelation to be John writing to the church because there's a new emperor in town and he is persecuting the church. And so he's writing to encourage them to be faithful. So I don't think this is some future document way out into the millennia. I think it has more to do with, I think prophets preach and lean into their time period more so than everything is way out into the future. There might be some future time to it, but I don't think they're doing something so generic that it's going to be for everything. And now, listen, I'm not, I don't want you to go home and say, this is the way it's got to be. I mean, I'm open to a little bit of debate, and I'm open to being wrong. The problem is we just don't have a lot of information to try to give us. So the best I can tell you to do is when you interpret the Bible and you study the Bible, you see those numbers to be more symbolic, well, this is probably where you're going to land. And that fits. And thanks be to God, right? But if you're more literal and you think the numbers are the numbers, well, you're probably going to get to this guy, and thanks be to God, all right? So, I mean, it's all good. That's the problem when we interpret apocalyptic literature. It is just not as cut and dry. And remember, we said this in the very beginning, and I remind us every time we study the book of Daniel, right? So every week this is just not as clear as what we would want it to be. And so there's going to be a level of gray or ambiguity depending on how we approach the text. And, that's okay. I mean, there's just some things that just aren't as clear as what we want them to be, in the Bible. And, you have to be honest with the text, right? So you don't want to eisegete where you start with what you know what it's going to be, and you read it in there and you proof text it, and, you read it, process it, and with context, come to the best conclusion that you can. And trust, so both of these have God as sovereign. Both of these have this covenant God who remembers his covenant. So the bigger themes of the book of Daniel, you're not splitting them. They're still there. Just the struggle is time. Is it when? And that we just don't know. It's a little bit harder. All right. Full day. You can eat and go take a nap. And anyway, go in peace. May the Lord be with you. And we'll see you next week. Yep.